Okay, so this is the last entry in a series of module rundowns that I started a little less still than a month ago with a live stream where I set out to run down every module. That one got through the interface modules and the analysis modules, and then I hit the control modules and just ran out of gas. So earlier in the week, or about a week ago, I published one on control or CV modules. This is the last one, which is audio modules. I'm not going to do one on effects because I think, as I said in the first live stream, if you don't know what a reverb is, we're at a different level. And those are, already built up and everything. You can explore them on your own. And again, the idea here is to be a supplement to something like the module index or the tips and tricks page. And I'm not going to go through every possible use of these modules. And in fact, this is my second take because the first one I did start to get a little bit too particular, and it just dragged, right? So I'm not going to explain every aspect of every module. I'm going to talk about some things that you may want to know as a patcher and briefly explain what the module does. So let's jump into it. The first module is an oscillator. I'm actually going to add a little keyboard down here just so I can change its pitch around a little bit. Let's use 3 keys. And I have it connected to a VCA, which I'll talk about very shortly. I'm going to connect a stomp switch that I set up down here to that VCA. So an oscillator makes noise. You can change its frequency and get different sounds. This is a sine wave, and we have different waveforms. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'll do like a sawtooth. And those different waveforms are defined by the amount of harmonic content they have. Every waveform can be broken down into what are called partials or components that are derived from sine waves themselves. So you can use a bunch of sine waves at different amplitudes and different frequencies to create a sawtooth or a square wave. It takes a lot of them, so this isn't generally how you would go about doing it, but that's the nature of additive synthesis. So we have different wave forms. We can put an FM input in, and this is a really complex subject, but traditionally what you would use FM to do is FM is audio rate frequency modulation, so like audio rate vibrato. And at audio rates, that frequency modulation creates changes in timbre, particularly when the two oscillators are set at inharmonic ratios. So if they're set at two frequencies that are part of the same harmonic series, you can get some very pleasing tones. When they're set at ratios that are not part of the harmonic series, it can sound much more grating. So I'm going to connect my second oscillator here. This is a sine wave oscillator, both to the FM input of our first sawtooth oscillator and to the keyboard, so they're playing at the same frequency. That won't do a whole lot, but I've got a second value module here, so I can adjust the offset of this second oscillator, right? And as I introduce different ratios, so here we have an octave up, and you don't really hear a whole lot of difference. It sounds maybe a little more metallic, but if we go to an octave and a half step up, right, because basically what's happening is that the frequency modulation is occurring at aperiodic moments, and so it creates more and more distortion rather than reinforcing the harmonic structure of the carrier wave, the wave that we hear, this oscillator that we hear. And you can create all sorts of timbres. You know, a lot of them are very metallic or inharmonic because of that. And, you know, you can also use other sources. I don't think this will be the coolest source ever created, but I have some loops running here, guitar and piano and that sort of thing if I want to use audio. Let's try a slightly lower note. We're not hearing a whole lot. Let me try pushing this signal up some. And that's one thing to keep in mind. The way that FM is usually controlled is by changing what is called the index, but it's really the amplitude of the modulator that affects the carrier. This might be heard better on a sine wave. So I don't think that's a sound that's going to take the world by storm, you know, but particularly if you use like something very rhythmic, like a drum machine or something like that, you can do some interesting FMing by using an external audio source. I'm not going to go over duty cycle. What it does is essentially change the symmetry of a waveform. So if we think of a sawtooth, right, we have this up and down, and it would push you know, more of the waveform this way, or might make it shorter and have a cutoff. And the general effect of these is to create more harmonic distortion in every wave, but the square wave, where it produces what is called pulse width modulation, traditionally, where you change the width of the pulse used for the audio. And that by changing that, you create a sense of modulation without a change in pitch. So it's you know, a classic synthesis technique that's commonly employed is pulse width modulation, which is when you change the duty cycle of a square wave. With the other waves, it produces generally, I'd say, grittier waveforms. And then upsampling, I don't use upsampling a lot. I don't hear a whole you know, particularly great difference when I do. Just gonna, so this is upsampled, and this is not upsampled. You can mess around with it. You may notice things that I don't, but if you notice, it causes a pretty significant jump in CPU usage, and that's per oscillator. So if you have, right now it's hovering around 11.1, 11.2%. If I turn on upsampling, it jumps all the way up to about 16%, so about 5% more CPU per oscillator. I just generally don't think it's worth the CPU budgeting. So that's the oscillator. I'm going to move on. The second module on the audio list is the VCA, and you're already seeing its effect. VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, and for some people that may make you think that it makes things loud, and it does, but it makes them loud from silence. So it has what's called an open and closed position, and the open position is unity. and the closed position is negative infinite gain. And the purpose of VCAs is really to make things quieter or silent rather than to make them louder. You know, you can flip that around and think of it as making something that's silent louder as it moves toward the open or unity position. But the way that they're classically used is as a way to take something like, in the modular world, is to take something like an oscillator. And the oscillator, if I didn't have this VCA on here, would just ring. It would go. So the VCA quiets it, and only when I press my stomp switch do we hear it. And you can use these for other purposes too. You know, I mean, they make good volume controls, for instance, and that sort of thing. They're used to create tremolos. One of my live streams from a couple of months ago talked about how to create your own tremolo, and the base audio component of that is a VCA. But, you know, they're really ways of controlling loudness and quietness, but that loudness goes up to unity gain. So it won't produce a boost in volume unless you know, boost the signal from the source to the VCA. And I have a video, you know, for people who are looking to get into synthesis, where I go into much more detail about connecting, you know, oscillators and VCAs and our next stop, which is filters, together. So the SV filter has 3 different outputs that you can select: a low pass, a high pass, and a band pass outlet. I'm only going to use the low pass one right now. And what I'm going to do is connect the input of my loops that are running to pass through the filter, and this is an expression pedal that I can control the filter frequency with. And as we push the frequency down, it gets duller and duller in sound. So the way that filters are generally represented is on a graph where we have amplitude on one side and frequency on another. And an ideal noise or sound source, which is usually white noise, will produce an even amplitude across the whole frequency spectrum. And the way that filters are often tested is with a noise source. What a low pass filter is doing is it's allowing frequencies below the cutoff frequency to pass at their original amplitude, but it's attenuating the frequencies above its cutoff frequency. So the effect of that is that it makes bright sounds that are higher in frequency quieter, and gives a sense of creating a duller sound. So you can open and close a filter, right, and make things not only quieter and louder, right, because you'll be decreasing the overall amplitude, but also change how they sound. The other element of a filter is its resonance. So what resonance does is essentially it bumps up the amplitude at the cutoff point and pushes it above this unity position. So it makes it louder at the cutoff point, and the effect of this is to make other things around it sound quieter, and to give a dramatic effect to the change at the cutoff frequency. It makes it much more pronounced, the cutoff frequency. So this is the classic sort of synthy filter sound. And we can hear sort of a wah as I move the filter with my foot. And a little bit of resonance goes a long way. So that's the state variable filter, and I'm not going to go through every instance. The way that a high pass filter works is the opposite of a low pass filter. So it will attenuate lower frequency things and make the audio sound brighter, or tinnier is often the effect that's associated with it. And a bandpass filter will attenuate signals that are above and below its cutoff point. So it only passes a certain band of audio. And the state variable filter can also be used for things like pinging the filter to create different ringing sounds and that sort of thing. And it also tolerates modulation better than the next module we're going to talk about, which is the multi-filter. And I'm not going to go through every aspect of the multi-filter. The thing that stands out about the multi-filter is twofold. The state variable filter's resonance only goes down to 1, and 1 sounds like a neutral position, but it's not. It actually means there's always some resonance on the state variable filter. So the advantage of the state of the multi-filter is that its resonance can be lower, or its Q can be lower than 1, which allows for better use in applications like EQ or something where you want the filter to be a little bit more neutral, because a resonant quality will impart that resonance onto the audio that it attenuates. The problem with the multi-filter, and the reason why they're not necessarily the best filter, is that they don't really care much for being modulated. So if you modulate a state variable filter, you won't see much of a difference in the CPU consumption. If you modulate a multi-filter, and here I've connected again my expression pedal to the filter frequency, there's a huge jump while that frequency is being modulated. So when it's static, it hovers around 6.7, 6.8%, but as I sweep that filter, it jumps all the way up to 15%. So that's almost like a little over an 8% increase in CPU, which makes them the multi-filter much better for static applications like EQ, and the state variable filter much better for modulated applications like synth sounds, or to create wahs. Wahs are created with bandpass filters, or that sort of thing, where you'd have the filter moving around in order to create effects. The multi-filter is not well suited for that, and it has most of the same options as the state variable filter. There are a couple of different filter types. So a high shelf filter would increase volume above a certain cutoff point without attenuating volume below that cutoff point. This is the tone control that's used in the tone control module for the high and low frequencies. They're shelf filters, so they don't cut off stuff below their cutoff frequency. They just boost things, so they can make low stuff sound louder without affecting the rest of the signal. And then there's a bell filter, which can either have a positive gain. If it has a positive gain, it boosts that frequency, or a negative gain, and if it has a negative gain, it cuts that frequency. So that's referred to commonly as a notch filter. When it cuts the frequency, and when it boosts, that's a parametric, like a parametric EQ. So that's the multi-filter. It's really useful for things where you're not going to be modulating the filter a lot. Now, it has some sonic differences, and if you find yourself in a situation where you really want to use the multi-filter, just be aware that doing so will require you to budget for a CPU overhead if you want to modulate that filter, because when it's being modulated, it requires a lot more CPU to calculate it. So we're going to discuss delay lines. Delay lines are a fundamental building block of an awful lot of effects. So when they're very short and modulated, they can create flanger and chorus effects. When they're short and unmodulated, they can create comb filters. And a flanger is essentially a modulated comb filter. As they get longer, they create what you think of as sort of the traditional delay, where one sound, I've sort of sketched out a delay path. One sound comes in, and then it gets delayed and is outputted at some delayed amount. So boom, and then boom. And then as you feed the output of this delayed signal back into itself at less than unity gain, you get quieter and quieter repeats at the same interval of time. So I've sketched out here what I've created, which is a flanger. So the audio signal goes into the input of the delay line, and then there's an LFO modulating the time, and the delay line is connected from its output back to its input to create a feedback path, and then it's connected to the output. So when these two signals are mixed together, you'll hear a flanging effect. So and I can affect that in different ways by changing the circuit. I'm just using the value module here to change the center point of the flange by moving the delay time that's being modulated. Now, my problem with the delay lines in ZOIA, and this is a long-standing gripe, is that they're not linearly modulated. And that distorts this waveform. So here I'm using a sine wave, and I've sketched out a sine wave, but actually the modulation ends up being much more like this than it does a smooth sine wave, because you'll notice, well, maybe you won't, but if I increase the depth, this might not sound very good, but it'll show more dramatically what's happening in this. Let's use a slower speed LFO. as it gets longer in length, as the delay line gets longer in length, it moves more slowly through this range rather than evenly. So it moves very quickly through the shorter delay times, and then seems to slow down as it gets to the higher delay time. So it creates a distortion in the waveform. And I'm hoping it's something that can be fixed in the future. Empress is aware of it. I've complained for a year and a half about it. And I suspect it is something that will be addressed at some point. But for the time being, it actually, in my mind, makes the delay line useless for a lot of these purposes. You know, I mean, you can create a flanger, you can create a chorus, you can do a lot of other things, but because the modulation is distorted, the waveform is distorted, it's very hard to create sort of traditional versions of these. They all sound wonky or off. So that's my explanation of the delay line. There are a lot of applications for delay lines, and I can't go through all of them. But I'll go through some of the features of the delay line. You can set it to tap tempo, yes or no, and that'll create a tap tempo input that you can actually tap in with your finger or connect an LFO or a stomp switch or a MIDI clock to. I'm going to turn it off right now, but you can do that. Interpolation off. So interpolation is a way to save CPU if you're not modulating the delay line. I'm gonna there's some buzziness. I don't know if that's coming through particularly in the audio, but the buzziness is caused by the interpolation being turned off. Interpolation smooths the changes in delay time, so it sounds much more musical. Because essentially what's happening with modulation is that the delay buffer is being cut to smaller and smaller segments as it's modulated. And interpolation will help smooth that cutting process. When it's turned off, there won't be any smoothing that occurs, and you'll get a much more distorted and harsh sound. But I point this out because interpolation can be turned off if you're not modulating the delay lines. And again, I don't think there's a lot of benefit in modulating the delay lines until this issue with them being logarithmically modulated is changed. Then it's a way to save CPU. It saves about 1 to 1.5% CPU if you turn interpolation off. So if you're making like a multi-tap delay or something like that, you know, you might want to look elsewhere for modulation and then use the different taps as non-interpolated delay lines. And then the final option is it can go from anywhere to 100 milliseconds all the way up to 16 seconds. And so, you know, the other aspect, I guess, that I'll point out, let's see how long this is. And this is an effect of the logarithmic time. It's set to 16 seconds right now, but even about halfway through its travel, it's still in very short millisecond times. But I'll point out that because it's a digital delay, it can work as a sort of primitive looper too when the feedback is set to 100% and there's nothing in the feedback loop like a filter or something like that. And this is one benefit of a digital delay line is their ability to loop very easily. So, that's something else to keep in mind about delay lines, and a potential use for them is a very simple, you can't really change the length. You'll introduce wobbling and weird noises. That can be cool, but it's destructive. It's ultimately destructive. You can't undo them, and you can't change the speed or anything like that. But if you're just looking for a very simple looping mechanism, delay lines may be a place where you want to consider spending some energy. The audio panner. The audio panner, I think, is maybe a misleading name because it can be used for a lot more than panning. The traditional application of panning would be you have a signal that goes in and you can determine how much it goes to a left or a right output. It can be panned all the way to the left or all the way to the right or somewhere in between. And you can create a panner with a pair of VCAs and some, inversion of values and whatnot. It's essentially what it is. It's two VCAs that proportionally change depending on which way you want the signal to go, but it doesn't necessarily have to go to a left and right output. And in fact, if we look at the panner, it doesn't call its outputs left and right, it calls them 1 and 2. So you could pan between two different channels, as sort of like a send effect, figuring out, how much of your effect goes down a signal path with a delay and how much goes down a signal path with a reverb that are running in parallel. But you could determine the mix for how much goes into one or the other of those parallel paths. You could also use this as a very sort of simple switch, audio switch. We'll get to audio switches in a minute, but there's a type of audio switch that's commonly used called a 2-channel out switch that's used for bypassing things. And a panner could also achieve that goal. There is a stereo option. So what that'll do is take a stereo signal, and when it's set at 50%, the stereo signal will go out both outputs. When it's panned all the way one way or the other, the stereo image will be lost. It'll be reduced to mono, and then various points in between. I don't love the way the stereo panner works. I generally, with stereo images, use 2 panners if I want to do some panning, because I think it preserves the stereo image better. But that option is there, and it's certainly useful in that regard. I just tend to do dual mono panners, which is, maybe dumb. I'll be honest with you. I might have like a real waste of CPU at that point. And then there's different pan types. Essentially, these are different ways of distributing audio across the stereo field. So if you think about it and you have a signal path that's coming in one input and going out 2 outputs, if at the middle of the panner, when it's coming out of both outputs, it's louder than it is at either extreme, it might sound off. So these are different ways of dealing with how the output is curved, right? I tend to use equal power. There's some descriptions of these in the module index, but you can play around with that. They do have effects. I don't notice them a ton, but I tend to think equal power sounds the best. So that's the panner. Pitchshifter is pretty straightforward. Let me kill these dry signals. So I've got my audio going into the pitch shifter. Let's hear a loop. I can pitch it up a fifth or an octave, and you'll notice a warble in the sound. The pitch shifter is sort of a notoriously loved and hated module, mostly hated in the ZOIA canon, because it introduces this sort of wobbling vibrato sound rather than a really clean pitch shift. So, you know, if you think of it more as an effect and less as a way of, you know, doing what a whammy pedal does. It's a different type of pitch shifting. And you can set it to sense. Because of the wobble, I don't think it sounds very good as a detuner, but you could try it in that capacity. You can also set it up by speed pitch, and this gives some indication, I think, of the mechanism that's employed in the pitch shifter, which you may also notice has a latency, just a little bit of a latency, and I think that's because what it does is speed up the sound, but it needs to hear the sound before it can speed it up, if that makes sense. It can also do negative pitch shifting. I think if it suffers as a pitch up, it's really not very convincing or full sounding when you're pitching down, and you have the same wobbling. I'll talk some more about pitch shifting when we get to the Granular module, which I tend to prefer as a pitch shifter. But again, this can be useful in some applications where you think of pitch shifting less as more as like an effect, a type of effect, rather than as an actual, like, I'm going to take this thing and shift it up a pitch. It's something that if you blend together with a dry signal can add higher or lower harmonics, maybe. So, you know, love-hate relationship throughout the ZOIA community with the pitch shifter. Next, we have the audio balance. The audio balance is sort of like the panner in reverse. So we have two audio signals, and we can combine them into one output and mix between them in the same way that the panner could also be used to replace a two output audio switch. A audio balance could be used to replace a two input audio switch. And the reason why I mention this with these is that it's a little bit more CPU friendly to use an audio balance and a panner in place of these two. It's not a lot, it's a teeny tiny amount, but you know, if you go all the way to channel 1 or all the way to channel 2, that's the same as if you selected between channel 1 and channel 2 on a switch. And it's a teeny tiny bit more CPU efficient to use these in place of audio switches. Don't ask me why, I don't know, but it is. It's something that I've noticed working with ZOIA for a while. So if you're thinking of using a two-channel audio switch, you might think about replacing it with a pan or audio balance module. And again, the saving is not huge, but if you're using a bunch of them in a patch, it might be enough wiggle room to add something that you couldn't otherwise add. And the audio balance is has a stereo mode as well, which is true stereo. So you have a left and right input and a left and right input on the two channels, and you get a left and right output. So it essentially works like two audio balances in parallel, rather than summing anything to mono. which for me is something important to keep in mind. The mixer, I'm really not going to talk about. I don't like the mixer. I never use it. I'll tell you why I don't use it. One is the scaling of the gain is really hard for me to work with because it doesn't, because it has a 20 decibel boost element, it doesn't scale to CV in the ways that I'm used to with a lot of other modules. So I don't like using it for that purpose. I also don't like it because it's not computationally efficient. If you wanted to have a 2-channel mixer, you could use 2 VCAs instead of a 2-channel audio mixer module and have a more efficient use of your CPU. Unless you really need the boost, which you can factor in a bunch of other places because you can boost audio signals natively, I just don't see the point of it. And even when you add in panning, it's more computationally efficient to use VCAs and panners, I've found, than the mixer. People may feel otherwise. You're certainly welcome to use it, but I think in a lot of instances where I would use a panner and a VCA, I've found that just using them as separate modules works better for me. But you know, the mixer should be pretty familiar. One thing to note, and this is mentioned in the module index, there is a panning option for mono, but it doesn't work. So, you know, don't use that, I guess. An audio inverter. So there are some applications for an audio inverter. In the feedback loop of like a delay line, you can use an inverter to change the sonic quality of something. You can use this in a flanger to change the filtering sound, or in a regular sort of delay. It will, it's sort of hard to describe the effect that it has, but it makes things sound a little bit more dark, I found. A patch where I use them all over the place is my emulation of the Strymon Deco, Decoratifs. So, you know, that has an inverted mode, and I use the inverter there to mimic the signal path. The real purpose of an inverter, and there are a couple of other ways that it can be used, but the real purpose of an inverter, I would say that the sort of scenario where you really might need it is if you set up a external effects loop within a patch, so you had audio coming in one input and leaving another, and then you had an effects loop that you inserted in the middle of that. Some effects will change the polarity of the audio that comes into them, or change the phase, and when they do that, if you mix it back in with the signal before the effects loop, and that's an example of where you might create an effects loop, is to create a wet-dry mix for an effect that doesn't have a wet-dry mix. It may sound hollow or thin when you do that, and that's because it's one of these effects that has changed the phase shift of the signal. So an inverter would be used there to flip it back, right? That's what an audio inverter does. And if you take two signals and they're inverted, they'll cancel each other out. That's why you're getting the tinny sound. But if you flip it again, then they agree with one another. So that's the audio inverter. Audio in switch and audio out switch. These are just two different, applications of the same idea. One is I've got a bunch of audio sources. Let's say I wanted to create a synth patch where I could select between the different oscillator waveforms, or I wanted a filter where I could pick from low pass to band pass to high pass. I could use an audio in switch, and then only one of these would be selected per channel, and I could use that to select which one it was. So anytime where you have a bunch of signal paths and you only want to choose one output, you'd use an audio in switch. And again, I talked about the special case of a 2-channel audio in switch. And a 1-channel audio in switch could also be created with a VCA. One audio or a 1-channel in switch is essentially, I forget how to diagram these all of a sudden, but it's essentially, yes or no. It's an on-off switch, right? Because there's one audio path that's coming in, and the condition of the switch determines whether it passes or not. So you could use a VCA or a mixer, I guess, or anything like that for either a 1-channel audio in switch or out switch. Those two modules are essentially interchangeable when they're 1 channel. And an audio out switch works the same way. You have one signal and you want to send it to, X, Y, and Z destination. Use an audio out switch. Now, for some reason, people constantly, and I'm sorry if you're one of these people, it's one of the most common questions that we get on the various forums is, all right, I've got 2 signals and I want to pick between them. And I feel like there's some mental block in people's minds where they see the word switch and they just don't, the language they use will be, I want to switch between them. And they just, I go, well, use the audio switch. So anyhow, this is the audio switch. It's really useful for signal routing. There's some more explanations about it on tips and tricks. I also go into detail about using out switches in multi-effects patches in my multi-effects starter pack notes. There's a footnote that's in the comments that goes into great detail about how I've employed audio out switches in that collection of patches. Because an audio out switch, we've got audio coming in and it can go to one of 2 directions. So the way that I generally make multi-effects is to tier these switches. So let's say this is a reverb and it would go back in there, and let's just say this is a bypass. So it would go directly to the next switch. This is a switch mechanism. This is a switch mechanism. And the next one is overdrive or something like that. I think that's off screen at this point. And the reason why I want to use an out switch here is because it allows for tails or trails, called both, because the audio that's passing through here, through the reverb, will be cut off at its source, but it'll continue to reach its destination, because there's nothing blocking that. So with an audio out switch, we're changing the destination of our audio signal, but it doesn't change anything downstream, so to speak. So, when I'm making patches where I have, signal paths that I want to choose between, I generally use an out switch because it'll allow whatever audio is still passing through that effect to continue to do so. And that's the switches. So we're picking up, this is an entirely different day, with the all-pass filter. The all-pass filter, I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't understand all-pass filtering all that well. If you remember when I did the explanation of a low pass filter, I had amplitude on one side and frequency on the other. And a low pass filter looks like this, where it cuts off higher frequencies. An all pass filter looks like this. And in fact, the definition of an all pass filter is a filter that passes all frequencies at equal amplitude or unity, which doesn't seem all that useful, but there's another dimension on this graph that I'm not going to try to show very well, that is phase. And I'll be honest with you again, I don't understand phase all that well, but it is related to time. And while an all-pass filter in the realm of amplitude and frequency looks like this, just a straight line, or an ideal noise source, its phase shift looks a little bit like this. And we can think of this point as a point where it passes 180 degrees out of phase. Again, I'm not an expert on this. The applications of an all-pass filter, traditionally that phase shift is employed in creating a phasor. And you can create a phasor in ZOIA using the all-pass filter, or a number of all-pass filters in series. I'll go into the options, and you have a selection of pole numbers. Pole numbers are equivalent to stages, so you can create a number of stages in ZOIA on the all-pass filter, either by selecting more poles or by running those filters in series. And the advantage there is that you can manipulate the individual stages more if you have them running in series. It's more cost effective to run them as, X number of poles in one all-pass filter. And there's only one parameter called filter gain, but filter gain essentially moves this out of phase position back and forth along the frequency parameter. So it changes where the filter will produce the phase shift. I'm not going to get too much more in depth about all-pass filters, because in case you haven't figured it out, I don't know a lot about them. But this is one of the ways they would be employed. I'll talk about them again a little bit when I get to the diffuser. And there are other applications for them. Again, it's not a module that I understand super well, and I've read an awful lot about it, and I still don't understand it very well. I'm not an electrical engineer or an audio DSP designer, so I know that all-pass filters are used in the creation of reverbs to what's called decouple signals. And I'll talk again more about that aspect when I get to the diffuser. But for now, this is where I'm going to leave the all-pass filter. The next module on the audio list after the all-pass filter is noise. And this is going to be loud. I'm going to turn down the volume on my monitors. That's noise. Noise actually looks an awful lot like an all-pass filter when you plot it out, because the idea of white noise in particular is to have an equal amplitude at all frequencies. That's, you know, an ideal white noise produces sound at all frequencies at equal amplitude. So noise can be used to create percussion. It can be, you know, percussion synths. It's often employed in the creation of hi-hats and snares and all sorts of things in that realm. You know, it can be mixed into other audio signals to create a sense of noise, you know, to give it an old-timey feel. But there's not a whole lot to say about noise, other than there are other types of noise from white noise, pink noise, blue noise, whatever, and these are produced by filtering noise. And at some point, it's not a huge concern, but at some point a feature that I might like to see in ZOIA is the opportunity to have that be a selectable option within the noise module, because they are well-defined filter slopes. So it seems like something you could maybe hard program into the noise module rather than have to add a filter stage to produce. But if you want to create pink noise, or, you know, whatever, you know, there's pretty good Wikipedia articles that describe the sort of filtering that you would need to produce that. So the next module is probably going to, audio multiply. So the audio multiply is a ring modulator. And it's the fundamental element of a ring modulator. And we can, in fact, create a ring modulator. All a ring modulator is, all the ring modulator effect is an audio multiply with an audio balance used to create a mix, a wet-dry mix. But I have some new loops today going, because again, it's a new day. I had to record some new loops. So right now we don't hear anything, because an audio multiply, if one of the signals, it's a lot like the multiplier module. If one of the signals is 0, then there's no output. And in a way, you can think of the audio multiply, it produces an amplitude effect, and you can think of it as a way of gating one signal by another. The aspect of an amplitude effect that occurs in the audio realm is that it changes timbre. So I've just put in a sine wave oscillator. We don't want it to be that high pitched. I'm going to adjust the pitch a little bit. And I'm going to start playing a loop. When I do, we don't hear a whole lot. The audio amplify requires a lot of amplification. And this is already taken care of in the ring mod. So, you know, if you're familiar with ring modulators, you're going to be familiar with what the audio multiply does. The big thing to keep in mind about it is that it requires a very high signal, both at the input and the output. The act of multiplication produces a lot of interference that cancels out the signal. So, you know, when you're using it, you want to really push up those audio signals. You know, the other thing to keep in mind, it's not all that different from a ring mod. If you're more comfortable using the ring mod effect, please feel free to continue to do that. It's essentially what the ring mod effect is without, as I said, the mix option, and if you selected an external input for the ring mod in every case. So it just gives you a little bit more flexibility if you don't need the mix control, for instance, or if you want to introduce mixing at some other stage in your signal path. So I employ audio multipliers a lot because that's something that I want to do, is control where the mixing occurs and that sort of thing. But yeah, they're, you know, the base component of a ring modulator. Bitcrusher, I'm gonna leave fractions off. Fractions just allow you to crush by bits that are smaller than whole numbers, so they give you a little bit more flexibility. You know, I'll pass a loop through. And I've got this. For most of the Bitcrusher's range, you won't hear a whole lot because bit crushing doesn't really become all that apparent to the ear until you really start breaking down those bits. So you'll hear some noise and some distortion when you get down to about 11, 10 bits. And basically what a Bitcrusher does is, if we think of an audio wave as something like this, when audio is turned into a digital signal, it's quantized, right? You know, a digital signal of audio is not a continuous signal. It has to break it down into bits and pieces that are digested. And the Bitcrusher just crushes essentially how many of those steps are taken into consideration. So the ultimate output of a Bitcrusher, and I'm going to turn down the connection a bunch before I show this, is a square wave. So if you're looking to create, like, let's turn this down way more. If you're looking to create like a square wave fuzz, instead of using the fuzz module, you might start with the Bitcrusher. So when this is down to 32 bits or 1 bit, it essentially turns everything into a yes or no, which is why it creates more distortion and more noise, because every little thing is either all the way up or all the way down in terms of amplitude. And if I play something, it's really compressed. And a lot of the dynamic is taken out of the signal. And a lot of distortion is introduced by that quantization, because, you know, essentially what it does, it is like a CV quantizer. It pushes certain parts of the audio signal up or down to fit into the bit depth that's selected. And in doing so, it introduces distortion to the signal. And so, you can use that again to create fuzzes and distortions and Bitcrusher effects. Used subtly, it can give a sense, I think, of, again, like the noise. You want to introduce a old-timey feel. A lot of older audio processes worked at 8 bits or 12 bits or something like that. And again, at 12 bits or 16 bits, you may not hear a whole lot, but, if you go back and listen to some of those old, like 12-bit or 13-bit Akai samplers, it's not as though they were unintelligible. It's a subtle effect to change the bit depth, beyond the extreme, but it can add, subtly to a sense of creating an old-time effect. An aliaser is something that is often associated with bit crushing. So bit crushing is, as I said, it's a amplitude effect. Aliasing is a sample rate reduction, and the effect of a sample rate reduction will be to reduce the harmonic content of a signal, and this produces a different type of distortion or filtering. So we have just one control for this. It's frequency amount. I'm going to run some audio through it at its native frequency. And this has an effect kind of like ring modulation at some levels. So the aliaser can be used again, and particularly in conjunction with the Bitcrusher, to both, introduce distortion and sort of quasi ring modulation effects, and really make a signal sound nasty. But again, used subtly, it can introduce an element of lower fidelity. Traditionally, an aliaser would be compensated for. So you'd have aliasing. Let's say this is the total spectrum of your audio signal, and because of the sample rate, there's aliasing at 1200 hertz. Traditionally, in order to get rid of some of those artifacts, I just point this out because I think a lot of people, think of like these lower sample rate effects or digital boxes or ADA converters as having a warmth to them. And the warmth didn't really come from the reduction in sample rate. It came from the anti-aliasing filters. So what you do, I probably drew this the wrong way since I've been drawing these graphs the other way. In order to get rid of some of those artifacts that we heard, the ring modulation artifacts, so let's say our sampling rate is at 1200 hertz. in order to get rid of some of the sampling artifacts or downsampling artifacts that we heard, you'd introduce a low-pass filter, which would eliminate some of the higher frequency content where those artifacts are occurring. And that's what really gave the warmth to those things. It would be the combination of the reduction in fidelity with the low pass filtering of the anti-aliasing filter. So, you know, if you really want to go for that sound, you need to combine the sample rate reduction with low pass filtering. I'll just point that out again because, you know, some people go, oh, you know, doesn't sound what I think of when I think of like a really low sample rate instrument. It's the anti-aliasing isn't built in. You have to add that. The buffer delay, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly. Some audio processes, not all of them, and I don't have a complete list, and I haven't ever actually been all that interested in creating a complete list, introduce a buffer. That's because of the ultimate processing speed of the CPU or DSP chip in ZOIA. And that buffer delay, or that delay ends up being 3.3 milliseconds. Just write that out. Each buffer delay, and you have an option to choose how many buffers, up to 8. Oh no, they increased it. Up to 16. Adds another 1.33 milliseconds. So the effect of this is that if you want to run some signals in a wet-dry mix or in a parallel mix of any sort, if you have an audio process that introduces one of these buffers, then in order to get rid of phasing issues, if it sounds thin or hollow or off, you know, if your ears hear it as off, you can try introducing a buffer, and depending on a buffer delay, and depending on how many buffers or how many processes one of the signals in parallel goes through, you might have to introduce, you know, again, 2 or 3 or 16, I guess. 16 is pretty extreme. But all that this is a very specific delay line. You can think of a buffer delay as a delay line that's quantized to increments of 1.33 milliseconds. And, you know, I'm sure there are people who are watching this and going, oh my God, that's so much latency. Guess what? All of your digital effects introduce buffering latency. It's part of the initial process of ADA, audio to digital conversion and deconversion. Buffering is a fact of life if you want to have digital effects. It's going on in Strymons and Bosses and all the world around, and they have buffer delays to compensate for that. So, you know, people get kind of worked up about this, and I find it kind of silly. The thing about ZOIA that I think invariably affects people is that it makes transparent a lot of things that are going on behind the scenes in pedals that they like, but they don't realize it, you know. So, oh, you know, expression pedals are wobbly. That's because most expression inputs have a built-in slew limiter. With ZOIA, you have to add that. You know, it makes it so you can see things that you can't actually see the specifics of under the hood in other pedals, and some people really freak out about that. So I'm sorry, but there's buffer latency in any DSP that you use. It's just part of the the thing that processing takes time. So the looper, we finally arrive at the looper. I've been using a looper off screen throughout this. The looper is a love-hate instrument in ZOIA. You can do some really extraordinary things with it. It's also a pain in the butt to work with. I'm not going to go through every application of the looper, but I will talk about a couple of things. There's maximum record time. Someone asked me why it isn't always set to 32 seconds. And I think that's because there's a RAM allocation made depending on how long the maximum record time is. So if you are only going to use a 1 second looper for some, effect, as opposed to a 32 second looper to record a phrase or whatever, you can save a certain amount of CPU by selecting 1 second, because it won't apply that RAM allocation. So we can go up to 32 seconds. There's a length edit that has a start and length control. So you can fine-tune the length of the loop. You can choose between playing back once or looping. Okay, length fixed versus pre-speed. There are these two options, fixed versus pre-speed, and I'm probably going to screw up explaining them, but I'll try. So the idea of a fixed length loop, I might get them backwards. The idea of a fixed length loop is that when the speed of the loop is changed, the actual amount of time it takes to play will not be changed. And we can hear this really only when we slow down loops. So a loop that is this physical representation long, if we slow it down, it takes twice as long to play back. And if we speed it up, so this is 1/2 time, and if we speed it up to 2 times, it takes half as long to play. The effect of a fixed length loop would be heard on the 1/2 side, where instead of continuing all the way to the end of this longer buffer, it would quantize to the original length of the loop. Pre-speed, again, you won't hear this with loops that are increased in length, but pre-speed would produce loops that no matter if you slowed them down, they would play all the way to the end of their buffer, not just the original length of the loop that was recorded. So, probably not something you need to worry too much about unless you're building a looper that does, like slowed down loops or down-pitched loops. But that's the difference between the two of them as far as I understand it. Here while record, I never use this because it can introduce weird phasing stuff, and usually I have some dry signal passing through, but you might employ it if you're not planning on creating a dry through on your patch in some place. If people will say, oh, it sounds weird when I do this. Turn that off if it does, because if you have a dry signal, there's going to be a phase issue, or you can use a buffer delay. Play reverse, you can play loops in reverse. Overdub, you can overdub, and I'll tell you, this is one of my least favorite aspects of all of the looper. And there are a lot of things to not like about the looper. The only way to get this wonderful button to reset a loop is to include the overdub function. And I rarely want to use the overdub function. I'll talk about why. When you record into ZOIA, it automatically switches into overdubbing if you have overdub on. I have a video called something like How to Get More Out of the Looper module that talks about ways to bypass this. Essentially, you send, as soon as your record signal ends, you would send a trigger to the playback button, and it would bypass the overdub stage. It would jump right back into playback, and then a subsequent signal to the record button would go into overdubbing. But I really want a reset button as a default, as just the way the looper comes, because it's really useful in every circumstance. So what the reset button does is clear the loop buffer. You can only access it if you select overdubbing. I never want to use overdubbing, so anyhow, that's one of my complaints. I'm going to go through the rest of these options. There's one more. So the stop play button is not actually a stop play button. It's a pause button. When the loop is stopped, it will stop, but when it resumes playback, it doesn't resume playback from the beginning of its buffer. It resumes it from the point where it was stopped, which is a useful alternative to the restart playback button. But you should know it's really a pause button. It's not a play stop button. If you stop the loop and then start it again by you know, this is, well, there's no loop playing right now, but this is toggleable. It'll start where it was stopped. If you want to stop a loop and return it to the beginning of its buffer, you need to stop it here, then send a signal to the restart playback button. So the big thing that I'll say about loops, and this is a real problem, and at some point we're going to get a looper version 2 or a looper plus or whatever. That's on the design docket. There's no ETA on that, but it's going to happen. I've talked to Steve enough times, and he's brought it up enough times that I'm positive it's on his mind. These buttons are a terrible idea. Just a terrible idea. Because what happens is if you try to connect some source like a stomp switch to them, it changes the state of the button, right? So, and then all of a sudden I think I've connected my stomp switch, so when I press it on, it goes to record, but no, because I changed the state, it actually goes into playback when I press the button. It's just, and now, so the thing to keep in mind if you're running into frustrations with the looper is twofold. One is that these buttons, when you make connections to them, change their states. They work as push buttons even when you're making connections to another module, which is a real problem. And secondly, if you have a loop that you think you've set up right and it's not working the way you expect, I would suggest saving the patch and reloading it, because that will reset some of these configurations, and that may be a way to avoid frustration. The third thing that I don't know why I said it's the third thing. The last thing that I'll talk about with the looper is that you can use two of them in conjunction to sort of, I do this a lot to sort of continuously record. And the way that you would do this is to send some alternating signal to the record of one, such that when this one was recording, this one would be in playback, and then they would switch their job. So you could do that with an LFO and its inversion. I often use a sequencer for this, a 2-track sequencer where one track controls the recording of one loop and the other track controls the recording of the second loop. So a 2-track, 2-step sequencer. But, you know, if you have them alternate between record and playback and send your input to both of them and connect their outputs both to the next destination, when one is recording, the other one will be playing back and vice versa. So you can use that to create sort of a continuously recording buffer that you can then use for, you know, all sorts of fun experiments with reversing and changing speed and pitch and that sort of thing. And again, when you make those connections, it may not work, and sometimes, I mean, you know, fuck, I don't know, pardon my language, but, you know, like I've been doing this a while, and I know how the looper works pretty well, and I still make patches where one time I set something up to do something using a mechanism I've used before, and the loopers just don't oblige. They don't go along with it. And I can't explain it. I'm sorry, I don't have great answers there. I can just tell you that when that happens, sometimes, you know, resetting the patch helps. Sometimes it doesn't. Granular. Again, I'm not going to go through every aspect of the Granular module. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some explanation. So the Granular module is essentially a micro looper. It's very close to the looper. The Granular module has its own buffer that it records into, and then the grain size will determine how much of that buffer is played back. And because it's a micro looper, the grain size, when it's below about 50 milliseconds, will produce oscillation. It'll sound like an oscillator, because it is an oscillator. You know, when you get below 50 milliseconds, you're getting into low audio rates. If we think of 50 milliseconds as hertz, it's actually 20 hertz, which is at the low limit of human hearing, and you start hearing some artifacts from that effect. As you push it further, the oscillation effect becomes less pronounced. So if you're not sure why it sounds like a weird oscillator in its default position, just start increasing the grain size. And the grain size goes up to 1,000 milliseconds. The buffer length of the Granular module is 1,000 milliseconds, or 1 second. The grain position determines where in that buffer the grain is played back from. And you can think of this when the loop, or when the Granular module is frozen, as sort of a way of moving through the buffer. When it's not frozen, the effect is essentially like a delay, because it'll delay the period in the buffer that the grain is played back from. So density is how many grains are played back at a given time. So if you have a buffer with 4 grains, let's say these are all the grains. The grains overlap, right? This is time, and they're playing back like this too. At any given point, this grain or this grain might not play, depending on the density setting. So the effect of that is a lot like sort of a tremolo effect. You know, at very low densities, you barely hear anything. At high densities, you don't hear any of this sort of muting. The texture is an envelope that is applied to each one of the micro loops. So because they're micro loops and cut off pretty harshly, they can sound very harsh, unpleasant, very clicky. So the texture allows you to apply an envelope. If this is our, you know, loop, we can apply an envelope to it to make it sound smoother and less abrasive. The effect of that is that the texture will also decrease the gain. So that's something to keep in mind. Speed pitch is just it's a lot like the control on a looper. It controls how quickly the grains are played back, which again are sort of micro loops. And I'll talk for just a moment. You know, people talk about the pitch shifter of the granular module being wobbly, and this is sort of a trade-off. In order to get a more robust image of the thing that you're essentially sampling, right, from the audio input, you generally need to use more grains, but the grains are set up in such a way so that they play in overlapping order, right? You record one grain and then another grain begins recording before the other one finishes, so that they have sort of a cascading effect, so that they cover, so it's not just on off, there's grains constantly playing back. And the effect of that, if you think back to the last drawing I showed, is that there are resonances that form because of that. And the granular module produces some resonant features, particularly as the number of grains is increased, although you'll hear it in all of the applications to some degree or another. Because, you know, as the grains stack up in different, you know, conjunctions, there will be points where grain 1 and grain 3 are both loud, and that'll produce this sort of spike in volume or resonance. So that's something to keep in mind. It's sort of the nature of the beast, so to speak. And the granular module can be frozen. Freezing it introduces or stops it from recording its input, and you know, some of these controls take on a new life when they're not responding to an immediate recording. So, you know, you can play around with the grain size and it has a different effect than it would if you were running this as a audio processor, live audio processor. Same thing with the grain position. It would move through the buffer of the frozen grains in a way that sounded much more like moving through a buffer rather than as some sort of delay. And you know, the granular module can be used for all sorts of different effects because of the way that it chops up audio. You know, and you can also use it, you can route its output back into its input and use it as sort of a weird delay. I will say that if you do that, you want to be careful about the signal that you use. As I mentioned, with different textures, you get different gain outputs. With the number of grains that you use, you have different gain outputs because you're recording more loops. And the granular module can also introduce some high and low pitch frequencies that need to be attenuated by filtering. This is another type of anti-aliasing filtering that I suspect has to do something with the way that the micro loops are recorded. But you can have these buildups of high and low frequencies in a feedback loop of the granular module, and it helps to put some filtering in the feedback loop to deal with those. That's the granular module. It's a really fun module to play with, but it produces so many different sounds that it's kind of hard to describe. But if you think of it as a micro looper, sort of that's capable of producing, you know, more than one micro loop at a time, that's a good way to start thinking about the granular module. Stereo spread. So there are two types of stereo spread. One I'll talk about is the Haas. And we could think of the Haas as a mono stereo spread. These are actually two very different processes, the mid-side and the Haas. So the Haas is named after the psycho acoustic effect of Haas, who discovered it, which is essentially if you introduce a delay on one side of a recording, it increases the stereo spread. So if you have a mono recording and you delay an output to one speaker by somewhere between 5 milliseconds and, you know, whatever, the effect is not of a delay, it's of an increase in the stereo image. So that's how the stereo spread works. I'll point out that, you know, I went on a sort of tirade about the delay line. The stereo spread is actually linearly modulated, unlike the delay line. So you have an input here, this is a dry output, and this is the delayed output. And you can use the stereo spread much more effectively to create sort of chorus effects, vibrato, than you could with the delay line. The real problem with the Haas stereo spread is that it only goes down to 2 milliseconds, which isn't quite short enough for some flanging effects. But yeah, if you're trying to create your own chorus or vibrato or even a flanger, I'd say instead of messing around with the delay line and its wonky modulation, try out the stereo spread first, because you can modulate this delay time. The mid-side stereo spread is from a different psychoacoustic effect. So how to explain this? So you have a stereo source and you record it in mono. It's discovered with microphones. In a mono microphone, you just have a source. It doesn't have to be stereo. You record it in mono and you also record it in stereo with a stereo microphone. Depending on how you mix the mono amount compared to the stereo amount, you can create fuller or deeper stereo fields. The And so the way that you'd use the stereo spread is to send your stereo signal to one output and then send it into the side gain, or no, you'd send a mono signal into one output, or you'd reduce the signal to mono and send it into one output. Then you'd send your mono signal into the other output and increase or decrease its gain relative to that mono-centered signal. So this would increase or decrease the amount of gain for the two stereo sides, while there was a mono signal being set at a established gain. And the effect of doing this will be to decrease and increase the depth of the stereo image as the two stereo sides are mixed relative to the mono output. So that's how the mid-side stereo spread works. I haven't explored it as much as I would like to, but it's a pretty cool effect. The bit modulator, there's a link in Tips and Tricks to an academic paper that I found really helpful in understanding this. But the bit modulator uses logic to compare the two audio signals and produce effects from that comparison. So it looks at differences in phase and amplitude and frequency, and the comparisons that are drawn between those use one of three logical applications, which is XORing. This is the most distorted sound, because essentially what it'll do is mix between one or the other of the signals. It also introduces some rectification. There's ANDing, which combines the signals, and then there's ORing, which chooses one or the other of the signals. And again, I'm not going to explain this very well. It's a module worth playing around with. I use it in patches to replicate a phased lock loop. If you've downloaded any of my PLL patches, they all use the bit modulator because, again, it creates, like a phased lock loop, it creates distortion when it makes a comparison between two inputs. That's how a PLL works. And so, you know, here we don't hear a whole lot because the two signals are closely related. But as I change the amplitude of one of the inputs, these are both coming from the same loop, the effect actually becomes more pronounced rather than less pronounced. And that's because the difference between the two becomes greater. So this is ANDing. And again, if you use two separate signals, you can get very different effects. I'm just using one signal and varying the amplitude. But I do use this as a very low-cost distortion effect. This is way, way cheaper than an overdrive module or a fuzz module. Just like a Bitcrusher is way, way cheaper than a fuzz as well. but the effects are very similar. So I use this as sort of like a really cheap way to get distortion into a patch. But it can produce all sorts of different results that sound kind of like sync or, yeah, lots of different distortion types. So the diffuser is the last module that I have. The diffuser is based on, if you want to learn more about it, what's referred to as, I might have gotten these two reversed, a Schroeder all-pass filter. And it essentially was a combination of an all-pass filter with a phase delay, which is a delay line. And the result of feeding a delay line back through an all-pass filter was to create more and more diffusion, because, you know, I mentioned that the all-pass filter passes all frequencies, but it doesn't pass them all at the same rate. And this is the important part of a diffuser. So what high frequencies and low frequencies would all be passed by the all-pass filter, but they wouldn't be passed at the same rate due to the phase shift. And because of that, you would take a signal and make it less coherent, essentially, in a smeared way that replicated the collection of echoes that are part of a natural space. So diffusers are Schroeder, I don't know how it's pronounced, all-pass filters that are designed to be used to create reverberant effects. And in fact, the story from Jay comes that the reason why the diffuser module is even part of the ZOIA arsenal is because he used it to create the reverb light, and they thought, well, let's just throw it on as another module that people can play with. And I'll tell you, you know, I mean, it's a lot of fun to play around with. I have some writing on tips and tricks about how to use the diffuser to smear delay lines. I'll just go through the different settings. So there's a gain control. This is equivalent to the gain control of an all-pass filter, and moving it around will have different effects on how diffuse the sound is, because it moves it through that frequency line. Size is the feedback amount. So the more feedback there is, the more size is made, because you hear more and more echoes. And the whole idea of this is to build up echoes at the very beginning of a reverb without introducing some of the comb filtering effects of delay network, because you want to use a short delay time for this sort of thing. And then the sample, the mod width and rate have to do with how the delay line is modulated. And so, you know, you can, the way that these are used to create reverbs is generally by running a number of them in series, because they get progressively more, the word that comes up a lot is decoupled. The input signal gets progressively more and more and more decoupled from its origin point. So, you know, the echoes pass through more and more stages, and in doing so resemble their original signal less and less. And that brings us to the end of the audio modules. This is going to be a very long video. If you sat through it, or any of the other videos, or any of my videos, I thank you. Obviously, a lot of questions that are probably left open at the end of this. And, you know, again, there are some things I'm still learning about and can't give great explanations for, including all-pass filters, particularly all-pass filters. But, you know, that's sort of the fun of ZOIA, at least for me, is that it's not just an opportunity to do cool stuff, but to learn about things that I didn't know before. So hopefully this helps you in exploring your own ideas for things you want to try out with ZOIA, and hope to use it to produce. All right. Huh. Thank you.